Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenter today as everyone is starting to file in. Oh, let me go ahead and mute myself on Zoom. Right. Welcome to the session, Putting Digital Accessibility into Practice, from WCAG Compliance to AI and Innovation. If you're joining us online, please place your questions in the Q&A panel rather than the chat panel, as chat will not be moderated. For attendees here in the room, please hold your questions until the end of the session. We will try to get to as many as possible. If we don't get to your questions, some presenters will join the chat and try to answer questions individually. This session will introduce you to digital accessibility and practical ways to incorporate accessibility into your workflows. We will also think about accessibility beyond just compliance and instead look at it as a way to drive innovation. To lead us in this session, we are pleased to have Victoria Polchinski. Victoria is a lead UX researcher with over a decade of experience advocating for accessibility in her roles as a UX researcher, UX designer, and UI engineer. She has worked at Fortune 500 companies and now works at ASU's Enterprise Technology on the UX and accessibility team.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? We're good? Okay, awesome. So, like she said, I am here to talk about putting digital accessibility into practice, from compliance to AI and innovation. Okay, so you introduced myself already, so I'll go quickly here. My name is Victoria Polchinski. I'm pictured here with the Grand Tetons in the background and myself in the foreground. I have medium length brown hair, white skin, and I am wearing a navy vest and gray long sleeve shirt. I am a part of the UX and accessibility team here at ASU, and I work at Enterprise Technology. Okay, so a lot of times when I join these presentations, I end up wanting the presentation after the fact. So I do have the link here. It's bit.ly/A11Y-practice. You can also scan the QR code in case you want the slides here today. So for today's agenda, I'm going to start off with a digital accessibility overview. We're going to spend the bulk of this conversation talking about WCAG compliance, and I'm going to share some really practical ways that you can integrate this into your work no matter what sort of role you are in. Then we'll talk about going beyond compliance and into AI and innovation. And we'll end this talk with how you can take things that you learned today and put them back into practice when you get to your desks tomorrow. Okay, so first, for an overview, I wanted to start with this question. So who here learned about digital accessibility in school? This could be high school, this could be college. If you don't mind raising your hand, if you're online, if you want to do like a thumbs up. Okay, so we have maybe close to 20 people in the room. I see a couple hands raised. I'm not sure if I saw any thumbs up. We have about 48 people online. And I wanted to start with this question because it shows that while accessibility is incredibly important, most of us aren't learning about it in school. We're not learning about it in high school. We're not learning about it in college programs. And so that means that we have a lot of work to do. And I remember I graduated from ASU with a degree in computer information systems. I was working at General Motors, and I was working as a UI engineer at the time. And I was trying to get more into UX design. So I was learning everything I could about UX design. And I just happened to stumble upon this article talking about WCAG. And I'm like, what is this WCAG thing? And the more I looked into it, the more I realized, like, this is something that as a developer, as a designer, I'm supposed to be doing this. I'm supposed to know this. And I'm pretty sure I'm doing everything wrong, like everything. So that was really my first introduction into digital accessibility. It's great to see that some people here in this room have learn something about accessibility through your programs. But it also means that we all collectively have a lot of work to do when it comes to sharing more about digital accessibility, informing ourselves. And so one of the big things that I hope everyone takes away from here today is that one of the biggest things you can do to help advocate and make your work more accessible, the work of your team more accessible, and the things that we do here at ASU or beyond ASU is to just ask, like, what about digital accessibility? If you just ask yourself, that's great because you can turn back to some of your work and start to incorporate more of these things back into your work, but also asking it in your team spaces, asking it just like of anyone, of leaders, like, are we thinking about digital accessibility? Okay, so I wanted to level set with this definition from Georgetown Law about digital accessibility, which refers to the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites, digital tools, and technologies by people with disabilities. And why is digital accessibility important? So, working at ASU, this is often a very easy sell when we talk about aligning this with our ASU charter and being about who we include and not who we exclude. So, this is one of my favorite reasons to point out when I'm talking to people at ASU. It's also a big driver of innovation, and we'll talk about that more towards the end of this talk. There's also an estimated, I think it's like 1 in 5 people with disabilities in the United States. And globally, the spend power of people with disabilities is an estimated over $1 trillion. So when you think about giving more people access to our tools, our university, there are a lot of people who want to have access to these things. So it really helps to extend the market reach. And then one of the reasons we're going to talk about a lot today, it's not the reason that I get super excited about laws and standards, but it is one of the reasons that most resonates with people when they first hear about WCAG is compliance with laws and standards. Okay. So what is WCAG? I keep saying WCAG. Some people use WCAG, but these, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines provide a unified international standard for web accessibility to meet the needs of individuals, organizations, and governments. And one of the things to note here is based on a ruling from the US Department of Justice earlier this year, ASU must comply with WCAG 2.1 and meet A and AA criteria by April 2026. So WCAG has A, AA, and AAA criteria. AAA is kind of going above and beyond, so I recommend going that direction whenever you can. But in terms of what we need to comply with, it's A and AA. Okay, so getting into compliance, I wanted to start with color because this is one of those things that's really easy to do right, and it's also really easy to do wrong. So when I was first working at GM, this was where I started because it's just like once you know this rule, it's really easy to apply. And I was working on my GM rewards. I was working specifically on the Chevy brand. And at the time, the colors were very similar to ASU, lots of gold, white, and black. And I was using gold text on a white background, which is a big like accessibility no-no. But I just didn't know until I like stumbled upon those guidelines. So I ended up going through my designs, making changes to bring them up to compliance and to make the contrast a lot better. And I shared these new designs with a group of stakeholders. You know, we had to go through this whole approval process. And one of the stakeholders was like, well, this is fine, but I like the old ones better. And this is like a kind of a common thing that happens. Like sometimes design, you know, people just prefer one over another. And I was like, okay, well, you know, I understand that, but I recently learned about this WCAG thing, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure we have to follow this. And like other companies have been sued because they didn't. And he's like, all right, well, I'll bring this back to the GM lawyers. And so that's what he did. He went to the GM lawyer team, and they came back and was basically like, yeah, you have to comply with these standards. So that was really like a great first experience for me of like pushing back a bit. Different things work with different groups of people, but in that case, like I was a new college hire. I didn't know I didn't know a ton about this, but just speaking out in different groups can really help make things more accessible. Okay, so two big color requirements here. One is that text, graphical objects. These are things like data visualizations, charts, and UI components. So things like buttons or like the outlines of form input fields must have sufficient contrast between the foreground and the background. And then the second big rule here is don't use color alone to convey meaning. For color contrast, normal text requirements are 4.5 to 1, and large text graphical objects and user interface components have a contrast ratio of 3 to 1. So one of the tools I have bookmarked, like I've had it bookmarked for years, is the WebAIM contrast checker tool. And this is just a really handy tool. There's a screenshot on this screen of the tool, and it just shows the foreground color, the background color. You can input different hex values, and then it'll output the contrast ratio. And it just spells out really like nicely what normal text passes, large text, and graphical objects. Okay, so I have this little exercise here with this. So for the people in the room, if you can just, shout out pass or fail, or give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you think this passes or fails. For those online, if you want to give a thumbs up if you think it passes, or some other emoji other than a thumbs up or reaction if you think it fails. So any thought? Yeah, I like this ooh face emoji. So yeah, pass or fail. So lots of fails here. We have gray text on a maroon background. For question 2, any guesses here? We have bold brown text on a dark gray background. I'm seeing lots of thumbs down in the room. Lots of, I wish I knew what the name of this emoji was, but yeah, okay, one pass. Awesome. And then for question 3, pass or fail. We have medium gray text on a dark gray background. Okay, getting lots of fails, some crying emojis. Yeah, so not very easy to read. So the answers to all of these are actually that these all pass, surprisingly. And I use this example to illustrate that passing contrast ratios are not always actually accessible. And so the W3C, this is the World Wide Web Consortium. This is the group that creates these WCAG guidelines. They recognize that there are issues with the contrast ratio formula, and they're planning updates for WCAG 3. But one of the things that you can do now is obviously you need to make sure that things pass minimum standards, but I always encourage people to go above and beyond whenever possible. So you can look at more like the AAA compliance, or you can just go like, I like to often do just like a eyeball test of like, does this look difficult to read? And if yes, like just update the colors to make sure that the contrast is better. I have here a contrast grid specifically for the ASU colors, and I'm going to go ahead and demo this tool. This is the 8 Shapes Contrast Grid tool. Oh, and that's what you'll see for as the default. Specifically for the ASU colors. The reason I wanted to share this link with everyone is it's just a really handy tool for identifying which colors pass and which fail. You can filter by this DNP, the key is down at the bottom, but DNP stands for does not pass. So you can filter out anything that doesn't pass. You can filter out things that, only or at the AA or AAA. And this just is like a nice handy tool. And you can use this like anywhere you work. So if you're not at ASU in the future, if you work at a different company right now, you can input the different colors and just kind of have this handy tool bookmarked so that you don't have to constantly go back and forth and find whether something passes or fails and what the color contrast is. One other thing to note is just because something passes, it doesn't mean it actually looks good together. So if you are not a designer and you need some extra guidelines, I do recommend going to the ASU brand standard guidelines to also see the colors that are recommended together. Okay. And any guesses here? Anyone know why you shouldn't use color alone to convey meaning? I see. Yeah, so I'm hearing from the audience in the room, I'm hearing color blindness, and yes, that is a big reason why you don't want to use color alone to convey meaning. So about 1 in 8 men and 1 in 200 women have color vision deficiency or color blindness. And on the screen here, I have a stacked bar chart with red and green categories. And actually, these there's so little contrast between the red and green colors that the colors are actually difficult to discern for anyone once you get into some of those smaller categories. I also have a simulation of someone with red-green color blindness on the other side of this screen to help illustrate it can be really difficult to discern some of these different colors depending on how you perceive color. So the other big reason, in addition to color vision deficiency, is that devices, environments, and settings also play a really large role in how we perceive color and how colors are rendered on a screen. So over on the far left, I have a image of the Boox E paperweight. It displays only in grayscale. And this is also very relevant for people who are often printing materials. So if you're publishing papers, if you're creating documents for classes that are likely to be printed, you don't want to use color alone to convey meaning. You don't want to say like, refer to the red line below to learn X, Y, and Z. Environments also play a really large role in how colors are perceived and rendered. So if you think about the experience of working outside or maybe like doing something on your phone on the go, often the contrast is very different. Something that looks blue inside might look purple outside. And in the middle of the screen here, I have an image of students working outside. So that's another big reason. And then I mentioned I work as a UX researcher. So, as part of my job, we often have one on one sessions with participants where we're asking them to share their screens. And it is very, very common to see people with different color rendering on their screen. Most often, it's using dark mode. And so, on almost all of our devices now, there are many different options for color filters, which is what is on the far right here. But you can do dark mode. There's so many different ways you can render colors, whether it's at your operating system level or browser level, to make colors look different than you intended. Okay, next up we have images. Can I get a show of hands or maybe thumbs up online if you have ever posted an image to Slack or social media or shared an image attachment in an email? Okay. Looks like almost everyone in person. I'm seeing lots of thumbs up online. So, one of the things I like about thinking about image accessibility, some of this talk is a little bit more geared towards developers, but really we can all practice. Like in your documents that you write, you can make sure your colors are rendered nicely. You're not using color alone to convey meaning. You can also make sure that your images are using alt text or alternative text. Um, so how might you describe this image? I won't call it out since I don't want to run the mic just yet, but this is a picture of my dog Jester hanging out in a garden bed. And the important thing with images is they need alternative or alt text that provides the information or function of the image. If you're a developer, this means using a image tag and using alt text to describe that image. So if just for the purposes of this presentation, I might describe this image as a small black and tan dog relaxing in a garden bed surrounded by green plants. There are There's a lot of like other considerations when it comes to writing alt text that's actually good though. So you want to make sure you're being descriptive and accurate. So an example of something that's not descriptive and accurate would be like a Doberman outside. And I say a Doberman because when Jester, my dog here, is put into different AI tools, most platforms think he's either a Doberman or a Rottweiler. So he's a little 12-pound Dachshund mix, definitely not a Doberman or a Rottweiler, though he thinks he is sometimes, but that's not descriptive. So I'm not really conveying the full meaning of this image, and it's definitely not accurate. You also want to keep it concise. So this is a good rule of thumb to keep it about under 150 characters. The alt text I have written here is 77 characters, but it really kind of depends. So like there are instances like if you are, let's say, an instructor and you're like maybe you're an art history instructor and you have a image of a piece of art, you might need to be way more descriptive than 150 characters. You also want to avoid redundancy. So in your alt text, you never want to say like image of blank or photo of blank because a screen reader is going to read that like image of blank. So the screen reader already knows by you using an image tag with alt text that it's an image. So you don't need to repeat that. And then the other thing is like if you are using, let's say you're posting this to Slack. Slack has an alt text like functionality, so you can post alt text, but if you describe the image in your Slack message, you don't need to describe it in the text and also describe it in the alt text. That just makes it redundant. You don't want someone to have to listen to the same thing twice. And then this is super important. So you also want to consider the context and the purpose. Things like ChatGPT and other AI tools can be really great for helping with writing good alt text, but you need to make sure your prompts are saying things like, keep it concise and like give it context and purpose because it will give you like paragraphs of how to describe this image and it might not be conveying the actual meaning in the way that you intend. So like this, I have very like generic initially alt text, but this text might be different if it was displayed on a garden nursery blog. So I might emphasize the plants a bit more. I might say a small dog relaxing in a garden bed with healthy garlic and onion shoots, asparagus, and lemon trees. It might be completely different if it's a dog adoption site. You might not want to emphasize the garden so much and just say that they're outside. Okay, moving on to hyperlink text. Click here. Any guesses where this might go? My dog. That would be a good guess. I did put some sort of hyperlink text here. I don't even remember where I directed it to, but the idea here is we have no idea where we're going when we see click here. None. There's no way of knowing. So it's super important to use meaningful hyperlink text to help screen reader users quickly identify useful links and to provide all users with clear navigation options. So one of the things I love about accessibility is when you're designing with accessibility in mind or developing with accessibility in mind, you're also just making the experience better overall. So if you have ever like scanned a site and you're like looking for something specific and all the hyperlinks are just like here, 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 here. It's like you're not able to use that as a tool to efficiently scan. So there's lots of great examples of bad hyperlinks like everywhere, things like click here, link, using just like the plain URL. A screen reader will read this as like https://www. And I'm not going to say that whole thing because you get the point. It's long and annoying. And some URLs are obviously so difficult to like discern just by listening to them. Good hyperlinks tell you where you're going. So things like class registration, loan application, flu shot. I always encourage my team to just like use meaningful hyperlink text in their day-to-day work too, because this is an easy thing to just kind of all these things are easy to forget to do when you're publishing things to websites. But if you do it in your day-to-day work, I feel like you're also making your work environment, so your Slack environments, your emails, all of those things, you never know who's going to enter those environments. And like if they use a screen reader, you don't want to have to retroactively make a bunch of changes. That can be a really nice way of making that environment feel super welcoming from the start. Okay, so show of hands, has anyone heard like screen readers? Quite a few of you, awesome. So one of the ways that you can navigate when you're using a screen reader is by like creating a list of links. And so here I have a links list example using the VoiceOver screen reader, and we'll see if this plays. Okay, I don't know if folks are hearing this online at all, but I will just narrate. No, okay, thank you. So I can just narrate. So this is going through a list of all of the links on the ASU homepage. We have admissions, research, athletics, alumni, giving, president, about ASU, find out more, discover what's right for me, view all rankings, first year student, transfer student, graduate student, international student, veteran student, non-degree student, learn more, learn more. And then it just starts going like, learn more, learn more. Now you notice like these are links that are completely like, they're really difficult to discern. They have a lot of numbers and dashes in them. We have a bunch of virtual tours. So it just says virtual tour over and over again. Find out more, learn more. So I use that to help show like most sites have some sort of like bad hyperlinks on them. And it's an easy thing. It happens often. There were a lot of really great hyperlinks in that example. But that's just like if you see virtual tour over and over again, if you're cited, you would have seen that it's like Tempe virtual tour, Polytechnic virtual tour. But if not, then you won't know which is which. Okay, so semantic HTML. Anyone a developer or like do any content development on this in here? Have a couple hands raised. Awesome. See some online. So semantic HTML is a really important thing to just be aware of when you are a developer, especially front-end developer. But if you're not, like if you create Word documents, if you create Google documents, it's also important to use semantic HTML. So using like headers that are actual headers within your documents and not just like styling things to make them look like headers. So what is semantic HTML? It's markup that defines the meaning of web content, not just its appearance. And it's important because it provides structure and context for screen reader users, enhancing navigation and understanding of the content. So for example, if you are on a form field and you're using a screen reader, it'll say like, if you have a list of radio buttons, they'll say like, you're on radio button, 2 of 4, and here's the labels for those if it's marked up correctly. So the HTML markup for like the content on this page, we have a header, the semantic HTML that would use an H1 tag, and then we have a unordered list, which is the bullet points, and then list items. So it would say that there are 2 list items. And these tags are really important instead of using divs. So I am totally guilty of when I first started out, I was like, why do we need to use all these when I can just style it however I want using CSS? The reason is because like you aren't going to be supporting all of the different content that needs to be, or devices that need to be supported. It's also better for things like SEO to have actual semantic HTML, and then instead of just making a bunch of div soup everywhere, which is what I was initially guilty of. This is also something that like it's not super hard to change this retroactively, but like if you're starting with anything new, this is a really important one to start with. And then what do you do when HTML isn't enough? So HTML semantic HTML hasn't come quite as far as the web has. And when it's not enough, you can use accessible rich internet applications or ARIA. And you can use the ARIA authoring practices guide to implement ARIA components correctly. So things like accordions, alerts, they have guidelines on how to use ARIA in a way that is, best practice. And even on their guidelines, like the first thing you see when looking at their pattern library is like no ARIA is better than good or bad ARIA. So they definitely encourage you to just start with semantic HTML. But this is also a really important thing to know about when semantic HTML is not enough. Okay. Last guideline we're going to talk about here is around keyboard navigation. So keyboard navigation is important because not everyone uses a mouse or can use a mouse to navigate websites. Pictured here, I have a woman using a refreshable braille display. And so this is why it's really important to test using a keyboard. This is something that a developer would be the one to implement this correctly. But if you're a designer or if you're someone who might test a website, you can also test using keyboard only. So I'm going to go over just 5 really simple, quick steps here for keyboard testing. There are more ways that you can test using a keyboard, but the first thing is simply just using Tab. And one of the things that you're looking for when using Tab is that you can go through all of the interactive elements on the page and that you're navigating the page in a way that seems really logical in terms of like how you would also view it. So if you are on the top left corner of a page and you're tabbing and all of a sudden you jump to the footer, there's something wrong. So that's just something to look out for with keyboard testing. When I first started doing a lot of keyboard testing, I would tab and then I'm like, wait, how do I go back to that thing? So shift tab will take you back to any of the interactive elements on a page. You can use the space bar to toggle checkbox values or select a button. You can use return enter to navigate from a link or press a button. And then you can use the arrow keys to scroll, select the radio buttons, and move between tabs. So I highly recommend just if you don't already use a keyboard often to navigate, this is just another really easy, practical way to get started with accessibility. Okay, now we're going to talk about going beyond compliance and to AI and innovation. So I wanted to start with compliance because you do have to just meet these minimum standards in order to go above and beyond. So what do these products have in common? We have Siri, audiobooks, typewriter, you can think of this as a keyboard, captions, Speechify, and Scene AI. Anyone want to shout it out? Sorry, what was that? Yeah, so one person in the audience said audio and text paired together. Yes, that is, there's text to speech here and speech to text options. There's a lot of commonalities between these different products. Most use AI, and in fact, some keyboards now are even using AI. Many are now mainstream products. So if you think about most people here have probably used things like Siri or audiobooks, or we are all using right now the auto captions through Zoom. Has anyone used Speechify here? Yeah, one in the back. So this this is a great product. The company was founded by a dyslexic founder, and the product allows you to basically import. You can import your PDFs, your docs. You can use it on different websites, and it's just a really nice. They have a lot of different human voices, so you can use Speechify to listen to your text documents, your PDFs, your websites. So this was huge for me when I was reading a lot of what I consider very dense, like academic papers that took me forever to get through. It's like going through those papers used to take me 3 hours on my own, and it's like 25 minutes with Speechify. And so that's another example of a tool that's using AI. And all are created for people with disabilities, with people with disabilities, which really leans into the disability community mantra of nothing about us without us, which states that people with disabilities are the experts on their own needs and lives. Okay, so unfortunately, I do not think the audio is going to play here. I'm going to just kind of narrate this a bit. This is a video from Microsoft with Scene AI. The person who is like the main character in this video is a blind user, and he's talking about how Scene AI has helped give him more autonomy in his day-to-day life. So he's talking about how he uses low tech, which is a cane, and now he has the Scene AI app, which is an example of high tech. And this is really cool because you can use it to I mean, essentially what it says, like see your world. So you can use it to look at text, read documents. He talks about how he uses it to like sort the mail now. So he's not opening his wife's mail and his wife doesn't get mad at him. And he's able to see things and read like, he's able to read cards that his children made for him. He's able to sit in a cab and like have the world narrated for him through this Scene AI app. And so this is a tool from Microsoft. It's just a way of being able to listen to the world around you in a way that gives him more autonomy to move throughout his day-to-day life. So he can use it for like, if you think about like cash, like being able to read the cash amounts and things like that. So I won't play this whole thing since it's not, the audio is not working, but if you have, if you look up Scene AI, you could probably find this video. This is from Microsoft. And I think a really great example of how when we think about going above and beyond and like matching needs with technology, like we can create really great products. All right. Okay. So now we'll talk about putting accessibility into practice. Any guesses here or anyone know the answer? When should you consider accessibility in the software development lifecycle or SDLC? Yeah. Every step. Yeah, absolutely. Every step. And I'd say as early as possible. And I have here on the screen, there's this idea of the rule of 10, and it's as you go up in the software development lifecycle, you're spending about 10 times more on accessibility as you would if you started from the very beginning. So I have this starting at requirements, but really I would say this starts more at like the very beginning, like planning inception phases. So when you don't even have a product, the best time to talk about accessibility is just like then, like, are we planning for accessibility? Have we budgeted for this? Like, who's going to be the person to evaluate accessibility on this site? So the earlier, the better. And as you move up from requirements, design, development, testing, and production, it just becomes increasingly more expensive. So like a lot of times accessibility is not thought about until the very end. That's when it becomes really expensive. So just the earlier you think about it, the better. And shifting left just, highly reduces the time and cost associated with accessibility. So this is another area where like anyone in this room, no matter what your role, like if you're just speaking out and saying like, what about accessibility? You don't have to know everything about it, but if you're just kind of helping bring that into the conversation, then that's something that will help make your products more accessible. Another thing you can do is use Cite Improve. This is a tool that ASU recently purchased. And in fact, there's another session after this one about Cite Improve where they'll go into that in more detail. But this can identify and explain accessibility errors and issues, and it delivers accessibility reports and metrics. It is important to note that Cite Improve, this will do automated accessibility testing, which will only ever catch about 20 to 30% of accessibility issues. There's a lot of accessibility that is just open for human interpretation. And so a tool won't always be able to catch every single rule. So for example, like alt text, like we were talking about before, this tool can identify whether there's an alt tag, but it can't identify whether or not like the alt text is actually any good. So like if you had alt text that, like using the dog example, that was like a Doberman outside, this tool wouldn't catch that that's not meaningful. And it's not accurate. And then how to integrate accessibility into your work. Um, we're coming kind of on the end of the year. A lot of people might be thinking about goals and things you want to strive for in the coming year or maybe right now. One of the big ways I think you can really incorporate more accessibility into your work is by being proactive. So there are 56A and AA WCAG 2.1 criteria that we must meet. So you could, for example, read like one criteria per day or spend 5 to 10 minutes reading about accessibility each day. And you could do this till you're done with all the criteria, for example. And you don't even, this is like for this one, when I first started looking at WCAG, I was like, oh, this is so much. Like, this is so much to know and learn. I'd say like you don't have to really understand all of it, but you'll start to just catch on to a lot more. And you can start to, as you're working, you'll be like, oh, I think I read about that previously. I should go back to that article that I read about. One of my favorite ways is to learn as you go. So you can look up your role specific accessibility best practices anytime you start new work, and you can add accessibility to your definition of done. So one of the things I like to do is like anytime I start new work, and this was especially true when I first started, was like, how do I make forums accessible? How do I make, these buttons accessible? So just like getting really specific about those best practices for accessibility. Next, you can fix production. So you could baseline with a tool like Cite Improve. There are other automated testing tools out there if you're not at ASU and don't have Cite Improve. And you can set a goal to say fix 10% of accessibility issues next quarter. And then lastly, and this is something that really anyone can do, it's simple, but it's something that's often forgotten. You can just speak up. So ask, how will we ensure we meet accessibility standards? You can have, if you want to get really specific about your goal, you can have this in 5 meetings. But really, like, if you're just constantly asking yourself, your team, and those around you, like, have we thought about accessibility? That will really help move that conversation forward and help make sure our products and services are more accessible. Okay, thank you all. You can feel free to contact me. My name is Victoria Polchinski. You can find me on Slack at vpolchin or via email at vpolchin@asu.edu. I have a few links and resources up here. So like the WCAG 2.1, the ASU IT accessibility website, Stark's Public Library, I think is a great resource, like just a great jumping off point to learn about like all things accessibility. And then there's also several Slack channels and communities like the Accessibility at ASU, the Design System Slack community, specifically the Accessibility channel, and the Ally Slack community. Those are both global communities. All right, any questions?
I have a question about with links. I find that even just like if I'm looking at an email and there is like only one word that is linked, like to me that doesn't feel like enough, and I'm worried that someone's gonna miss that. So even though we're trying to make it more simplistic in a way, of being like, it's exact, but also sometimes that one word would do enough. It'd be like, oh, go to, gosh, no, I can't, of course, think of an an example, but something could be as simple as just this one word. But like my worry is just that you can't see it. Is it okay to do multiple words to make it so it is more like visible?
Yeah, so multiple words are always fine. So the idea here is really to make sure that it's meaningful. And so sometimes like I have had instances where I'm like, oh, this one word doesn't seem quite visible enough, so I might add a couple words. Generally, I've heard it's best practice not to add like a bunch of verbs. So it's best not to have like go to class search to register. It's better just to say like class search registration. But you can definitely add more than a single word. And you can also do a couple other things to make it stand out. So make that hyperlink bold, make sure it's underlined, make sure it's that like typical underlined blue color to draw more attention to it.
Okay, and one more actually with
Mhm.
that is if you in like the words, the sentences or whatever around the link, if you were to be like, to check out our anatomy guide, click here, and then but you did the link for click here, you probably still shouldn't do that. It should be anatomy guide, even though you have kind of made it pretty clear what you'll be going to.
It is great question, and it's almost I feel like when I first learned about this, I almost had to rethink how I wrote everything because we're so used to saying like click here. And the reason you don't want to do that is like the two reasons I mentioned. So if someone's using a screen reader or they're using like keyboard only to navigate, then they're not going to navigate to the meaningful part of that text, even though it was stated elsewhere. And then people are going to, if they're scanning, they're going to scan and see click here. They're not going to see the anatomy guide. And so, yeah, you would just want to rewrite the sentence in a way that, like, a lot of times you don't actually even need to say, like, click here at all. It's just something that, like, I think we've gotten so used to writing that way. So it's like, it does take a second to kind of rethink how you write text so that the meaningful hyperlink text makes sense in that context.
Okay, thanks.
Great questions.
Terry has a question online. Terry, go ahead.
Carrie, we can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Sorry, inadvertent hand raise there.
Okay, no worries.
Okay. We do have a list of questions online. The first one was, do you have a cheat sheet of things you have come across? How you said gold text on white background, etc.
I wouldn't say I have a cheat sheet. There are a lot of, I mean, that's one of the big ones I just mentioned at ASU because I don't see it as much anymore. And I think that's a testament to like the accessibility work that's being done here. But yeah, that's a really common one. The common ones that I actually like think are the biggest, most common problems are the ones that I mentioned in this talk. So color contrast, meaningful hyperlink text. I still see things like click here all the time. One that I didn't mention because it's not as developer focused, but it's just writing in plain language. And so there are tools like ChatGPT can be really helpful for that. So like writing in a way that's clear and concise. So even though we're at a university, like still writing in really like clear sentences is important. But yeah, most of the ones that I recommend, I did list here.
Okay, another question was, other than Envita, what other screen readers have you experienced that work great?
So the most common ones are JAWS, NVDA, and VoiceOver. It really depends on like the person's personal preferences and then whatever device you're using. I'm not as familiar with the ones that are mobile specific. And then Microsoft, I'm blanking on the name of it now, but they have no, it's not going to come to me. They have their own screen reader as well. So I just recommend like if just learn one of them. They all have their own like little shortcuts.
Immersive reader?
Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay.
But yeah, like they all have their own little like nuances and things like that. So I do like to use screen readers anytime we're producing new materials to send to participants for conducting research. And so just find little ways to integrate it into your day-to-day work. They can be a little hard to use at first, but just practice and persistence is, I think, the way to go there.
We have a question in the live room.
Hi, I have a question similar to the first one about hyperlinks, but more specifically about CTA buttons. I'm the web editor for the law school, and we have a ton of CTA buttons on the pages that just say learn more. Um, and so I'm sure it's probably like read the same way as a regular hyperlink is on a web page. But I also am like really conscious of having like a CTA button that is just like a giant uh thick line pretty much instead of like a circle or oval. So I was wondering if you just had any uh input about that.
Yeah, so that one, and I'm guessing a lot of your CTA buttons, they look like buttons, but they're actually hyperlinks. So they're actually just using the A tag. We have a lot of like, if they're just navigating somewhere else, then like the semantic HTML there would be using just like a hyperlink tag. But yeah, I need to honestly read more about this because I've thought the same thing. I think the best practice there is to still just have like a short and sweet hyperlink that's like no more than 3 words and
Yeah.
says more than learn more. That does require different types of like design though. So like I know it's a really common pattern to have like text and then the CTA or call to action button. One thing that can maybe be somewhat helpful is like if you have if you're using some sort of header in that card, another way of navigating using a screen reader is having navigating via all the headers. But it's still like if someone wants to navigate via a list of hyperlinks, then the learn more isn't going to do them much good.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's I feel like it's kind of a need of changing the way we do some of those cards so that it doesn't feel like learn more is the default.
Okay, cool. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
great question.
Another question in the online, is there a best practice about which kinds of links should be categorized as links and which should be buttons as they are interpreted by the screen reader?
Yes, absolutely. So a hyperlink is using an A tag, and that is a link where you're going somewhere. A button, so that's like you're using the tag button. That is changing something on the page. So it could be changing the way the page renders so that there's a modal. It could be submitting like a form, but that's when that's when you should use a button versus a hyperlink tag. So like the A tag. And you can design a hyperlink tag to look like a button, and that is totally fine. But the semantic HTML for it matters. And so that if you're just going somewhere, if you're sending someone to a different link, that's when you want to use that A tag. If you're changing the way a page is rendered or like doing something like that, then that's a button tag. Great question. Any other questions?
We have one more in the Zoom room. As a student looking for an internship and entry-level software engineering position, what would you recommend to build an accessibility-focused resume?
Ooh, that's a good one. So, I mean, part of like I guess being a software engineering student is like if you can just make sure you're integrating these practices in like early and often and demonstrating that in like a lot of times when you're looking for internships as a software engineering student, you're also going to have code examples. So I'd say using those code examples and then mentioning something about accessibility and WCAG, like your knowledge of WCAG guidelines in your resume, I think can also be really great, especially if the resume is specifically asking for that. I'll say if you're a hiring manager, I always ask for accessibility, like as a like knowing about WCAG and things like that in job postings. So I'd say how much you talk about accessibility might depend on what the job posting says, but I'd also make sure that you can just demonstrate that through your code examples, that you know how to implement something in a way that's accessible. Any other questions? All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Victoria. We'll begin the next session.